some years now since I stopped doing news journalism and doing features and other things now as I do. So I'm not entirely up to date on the latest technology, on the impact of social media and other things like that. But I do think that I can talk with some authority on some of the problems which I know are facing journalism, and particularly news journalism these days. And I think the first one is that for news journalism, reliability, accuracy, and honesty have never been more important than they are now, because your listener, your viewer, your reader is faced with a whole welter of information, some of it deliberately falsified, some of it doctrinaire, ideologically twisted, lies, and truth as well, of course. And so it is very important to journalists and journalistic institutions to establish for themselves a reputation for truth, which means that when people want to find out what the truth is, what really happened amidst all this welter of information, they know where to turn to. So that's, I think, the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is that there has always been in news broadcasting a tendency to sensationalize. I think, again, this temptation is stronger now because people believe that sensational news is news which attracts viewers and readers. And of course, all media outlets nowadays are under stronger and stronger pressure to attract readers and viewers and listeners because the competition is so steep. But if you start going in for sensationalism, then there's no hope of your actually providing reliable news, the sort of news I started off by talking about. Then the third problem I think people face today, many of them, is the problem of ownership. So many newspapers and broadcasting channels are owned by business houses, sometimes by business individuals. And therefore the profit motive becomes the most important thing. And that means that they go chasing ratings through sensationalism and in other ways provoking argument rather than trying to get people to listen to each other, and all the other ills which we see particularly on our television screens these days. So that's another problem that journalists face. And then, of course, there is the problem that many journalists face, I know, particularly young ones, of unfair employment terms, particularly short-term contracts. You cannot expect a journalist to do her job or his job properly if he only knows that he's got a job for 6 months or something like that. Then the journalist will be under huge pressure to try and make an impression. And that was not what he or she should be doing. He or she should be considering rationally and calmly what the story is, finding out what the story is, again calmly, and presenting it calmly. And I personally dislike intensely the style of presentation where journalists on the spot wave their hands all over the place and try and give the impression of being tremendously excited. We didn't used to do that on television. We used to be really fairly calm and straightforward in the way we presented it. One other thing which I think is very sad about presentation, particularly on television and on radio, is that you so rarely see nowadays a skilled, properly prepared television news story. One of the things which the highest crafts of news journalism, certainly on electronic media, is trying to present it in a way which is visually accurate, but also visually cohesive. So often what you get now, instead of a properly crafted story, a reporter speaking off the top of his head or her head, and very often actually repeating themselves or getting the story wrong or something like that. So I think that we need to go back to the art of television news stories and radio news stories presented in this mini documentary form, if you like to call it that. And you know, the last thing I think which follows on from that is that I think journalists are made to work far too hard on the spot. Most journalists working on the spot have to keep on filing stories or keep on being interviewed. Now, if you have to keep on being interviewed or keep on filing stories, there's no way that you can then find out what is going on. And so, in the end, you journalists end up either just repeating himself or asking the newsroom even to tell him what is on the agency tape or something like that, because he or she doesn't have the time to find out what is going on. So people are asked to work for far too long time and far too intensely. And this is all a result of this rolling news. And nowadays it affects newspaper reporters as well. When I was a journalist, in the heart of my journalist campaign, we all rather envied newspaper correspondents because they had one story to do, and that was it. But of course, they were using their time very valuably because they were able to find out in depth what was going on, investigate side branches of stories and things like that. So again, I think it's very necessary that journalists are not asked to work under the conditions that they are now asked to work. And lastly, of course, I would say that one of the tragedies of modern journalism is the number of journalists getting killed or getting wounded. This is an absolute tragedy, and news organizations should not encourage journalists to endanger their own lives. It is a tragedy when a journalist gets killed, and being stupid, running into danger, is being stupid. It's not being wise. And lastly, I would just say this, that in all these problems I've outlined, and all of them really would be attended to if journalists stood together. But unfortunately, we are not a profession. We don't behave as though we are a profession. A doctor, if he behaves badly, gets thrown out. A doctor, if he's in trouble or if he's put under pressure, has the support of his professional body. We don't have anything really which is an effective body of journalists which acts both in a disciplinary way and also in a supportive way. And if we all stood together, for instance, would we have these short-term contracts? No, we wouldn't, because we would say we refuse to work under those conditions. But you know, so often when I ask young journalists why they work under these conditions, they say, A, there's no alternative, I have to do it or don't do journalism, and B, anyhow, if I demonstrate you know, my disapproval by walking out and saying, I won't do the job under these conditions, someone else will immediately step in and do it. So lastly, I'd say, we journalists, and I've said this for years now, and so no signs of it happening, but in the end, we journalists, if we want to solve our problems, if we want to keep our profession as we would like to keep it, if we want to be really professional journalists, we should stand together. So I'm sure you're going to have a fascinating time. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but you can't be in two places at once. So I wish you all the best. I'm sure that you will discuss all the things I've talked about and many more. I hope you find solutions for some of them, and I hope you have a really productive, instructive, and enjoyable ICANN conference.